Okay, welcome to those who are joining. Just apologies for the delay. And as people join, I will just apologize again for the delay when more people have joined. But for now, we'll just let people join. I'm just giving a minute for people to join. Thank you for those who are with us, and apologies for the delay in the start. Okay. I think I can. Let me kick off, and because we're already running quite late. And so my name is Mark Wegerif, and you are very welcome to this webinar. Apologies for the delay. We had some technical problems, but I hope they're all sorted out now. So we really appreciate you joining us, and appreciate Zakes for coming here to share, and you for coming here to listen. As I said, I'm Mark Wegerif. I'm with the Department of Anthropology, Archaeology and Development Studies, where I lecture in development studies. I know the invitation to this said I'm a respondent. I'm going to be more of a moderator. I'm sure I'll come with some responses as well, but I'd like to encourage everyone who has joined to be part of the responses after Zakes gives his input. So, and Ramadan Kareem to our Muslim friends. Ramadan has started today. So if anyone's fasting, wish you well with that. And with the food prices, as we celebrate iftar and all of us just try and eat, I think this is an ongoing struggle, which is not unrelated to the input that is going to be made today. I want to thank the Center for Advancement of Scholarship, CAS, and the team, Tafadzwa, Kirsty, Cecilia, who have been working on organizing this. And I think it's really important that when students do PhD research, that it gets shared. So I really welcome this kind of event as a platform where, in this case, Zakes Klatchwayo, as a PhD candidate who has just been finishing up his PhD research, takes the time to share it, and others of you take the time to listen in and join the discussion about it. We need to do more of this. We need, so much work goes into a PhD. We need to make the most of it. And, I think even from Zakes' PhD, there's even more discussions we can be having. Today, there's a particular focus on the desegregation of agriculture in South Africa. I'm not going to talk about his PhD. I think he will talk about that. I should disclose that I'm the supervisor, so I'm a bit biased, and that's one thing that maybe makes me not such a good idea as a respondent. Hopefully, I'll be reasonable as a moderator. And I want to congratulate Zakes on getting to this point. The PhD is submitted, it's gone for examining. So there's a nervous wait for the feedback from examiners, but Zakes has done his part and submitted it, and it's there with the examiners. So congratulations, Zakes. And yeah, you can use those clapping hands. Someone's got that initiative. It's a really, it's a big achievement and a big step. So thanks for that. And then again, for sharing some of the work here. So just to briefly, what we're going to do today is that I'll just introduce Zakes now, and then he's going to give an input for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up for discussions and comments and dialogue. So really, see yourself all as respondents. You've taken the time to be here, and we welcome your questions, but also your contributions and your thinking, about what Zakes is going to be presenting. So Zakes Klatchwayo, he's obviously a PhD candidate, just at the end of that PhD journey. He has been supported by the Human Economy Program at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship and registered as a Development Studies PhD candidate. But Zakes has a very long background in land issues, which are related to the issues he's going to be talking about today. It starts even before the blurb in the flyer, with Zakes' involvement in the struggle against apartheid, where I think he saw the land injustices as one of the injustices that needed to be challenged. And then post-apartheid, Zakes also worked as the director for the Northern Cape Association for Northern Cape Rural Advancement, ANCRA, later for the National Land Committee. He was also the chairperson of the South African NGO Council for some time. So he has a rich history in the NGO sector, in the development sector, and working on land issues. So if we were together, I would say just give a clap for Zakes and welcome him. I'll clap. And I think you, as attendees, you're probably not even able to. I hope you can use the response keys there. Please do feel free to use the chat as well. I'm assuming the chat is open. So, feel free to engage in the chat with questions or sharing, and introduce yourselves as well if you want to. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Zakes for his input. Zakes, welcome.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'll try to talk to the slides rather than. I'm just trying to share. Can you see my screen? Hello?
Yep, it's quite visible. It's fine.
Okay.
Yep, good.
All right. Like I said, I'll talk to the presentation instead of really reading. The title of the paper is Desegregation of Agriculture, Myriad of Complex Challenges. And perhaps the subtitle would be a critical race theory on agrarian reform, which is actually the focus of my presentation today. So really, it's around the a theory which would actually look at the racial aspect of land reform or agrarian reform much more broadly in the country. I'm trying to shift. We still have some technical glitches here. Is it? Yeah. There's the one. We're having some glitches here. Technical glitches. Oh, there you are. Just a very brief outline. I'll just get into the introduction quite quickly. The background to the research, the methodology, the finding, and ultimately the analysis and conclusion. Then, as Mark has suggested, we would hope that we'll have questions and discussion for further discussion. Just briefly, racial segregation and discrimination, commonly known as apartheid, was built on the ideology of white supremacy that shaped the reality of South Africans, especially with regard to...
Zakes, can you just keep your voice up a bit?
Oh.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Let me just move it a little closer here. Racial segregation and discrimination, commonly known as apartheid, were built on the ideology of white supremacy that shaped the reality of South Africans, especially with regard to land relation and production relation. So ever since, colonialism and ultimately the advent of apartheid, South Africa's white domination actually structured not only the social relation society, but most importantly, structured the agrarian relation, mostly governed by the theory of Herthogism, or the superior nation of the white supremacy, premised on white supremacy. But most important is that more than 3 decades since the inauguration of democracy, very little has changed insofar as the land redistribution, reforming the agrarian relation, as well as reforming the production system in the country. Partly because of pre-existing racist injustices and inequalities that were institutionalized during the time of apartheid and carried through racism, which negates the transformation process in South Africa. So we have these shackles of the past that is shackling transformation, and especially agrarian reform in the country. For the purpose of this discussion, I use critical analytical tools of critical race theory as a methodology to mystify the condition, the history, and the lived realities of people who are often invisible and silent by pervasiveness of white supremacy, capitalism, and neoliberalism. That's the methodology which I use based on the critical race theory to begin to unfold and perhaps thoroughly examine the lack of transformation that is currently happening in the country. And then I propose a critical race theory on agrarian reform to examine racism as how it operates in agrarian reforms and agrarian relations in South Africa. I give specific attention in my analysis in the way of stories that I've been listening to, the data that I've been collecting from the field, which I carried out over a period of 3 years, and I'll elaborate on that as we go on. I want to emphasize that critical race theory has been widely used in law, education, and in feminism. So it's not a unique and a new way of looking and analyzing the issue of race. And I must emphasize here, the idea is not really to discuss, the force of gravity. By that I mean it's not to discuss whether biologically race and race does happen, whether the scientificness of racism. But I'm saying, looking at the practices, social practices of racism, the argument whether race is biologically valid or scientifically valid is neither here nor there for the purpose of this presentation. Now, the argument that I'm making, just sorry, just a minute. Okay, there you are. Let me go back a bit. Now, the argument I'm making is that race is the cause of racism. And racism is the effect of race. Racism is what ensues when we practice the ideological concept of race and color. Systematic and institutional racism is what transpires when we use the ideological concept of race. This is my argument, and debates and discussions are premised on these 3 points, that race is the cause of racism and is the effect, race is the cause and racism is the effect. That's the first argument I'm making. 2 is that racism is what ensues when we practice the ideological concept of race and color. And 3, systematic and institutional racism is what transpires when we use the ideological concept of race and color. This is where my argument and debate on the paper is premised. Very just broadly, I'm sure most of us would be aware of South Africa's history of colonialism, settler colonialism. More importantly, I mean, some of the most oppressive legislation that were passed by the apartheid regime to alienate land from the a majority of Black people. Here we talk about the 1913 Act and 1956 Acts. Of course, there are many other acts and regulations and policies that perpetuated racial segregation and land alienation in the country. But I think these 2 for me are very significant and important for discussion that I'm leading. For the purpose of this discussion, really, I looked at the qualitative method, a case study. I looked at 3 agri-parks in the Northern Cape. 3 case studies in the country, 1 in the Northern Cape, 1 in Gauteng, and 1 in Limpopo, the Livubu. I also used ethnographic observation, going along, setting of people, staying of people to better understand their situation and conditions of operation. So I did a lot of ethnographic research. Now, ethnography is suited for studying small-scale isolated tribal cultures with an emphasis on cultural particularism and local context. So there's a reason why I actually prefer, for the purpose of this study, to look at ethnography as a way of zooming into the lived experiences of the people that I was talking to. In this approach, I was looking at what is going on here. What does it mean to be a member of this group? These are some of the questions that I asked myself. Now, in ethnography, there are 3 main issues that one looks at: is to discover, experience, inquire, and examine much more thoroughly the experiences of Black farmers in this instance. Now, using qualitative study, inductive analysis was conducted. So that's how the analysis was done. I use critical race theory within an interpretive framework to understand and explain how Black farmers make sense of transformation embedded in pre-existing racism and the jurors of the vestiges of apartheid status quo. I argue that the colorblind analysis of post-apartheid grand structures and grand relations manifest a refutation of pre-existing racialized injustices and inequalities. That's the premise, again, one point which I say, one cannot refuse or ignore racist policies that continue to discriminate against and marginalize the majority of Black farmers. I bring, theoretical insight, we say that race is a normative historical construct used an instrument of power. Again, I want to emphasize that race is an instrument of power in South Africans' agrarian relation, and it continues to shape and influence our policies, particularly in agrarian reforms and restructuring of agrarian relations in the country. Critical race theories scholarship increasingly used to uncover institutional racism, inequity, and legal injustices. And it informs the struggles of resistance that were taken by mainly, scholars and societies in the USA. Critical race theory was first expounded by professors and Derek Bell and others in the 70s, 80s to examine the ways in which racism is embedded into American law and other modern institutions, maintain the dominance of white people in influencing and shaping public policy and influencing public discourse as well. Critical race theory argues that racism is not about individual bigotries or prejudices. It's a systematic and structural process that reproduces injustices and inequalities. Crenshaw says it's a way of seeing and attending to, accounting for, tracing, and analyzing the ways that race is reproduced. So the understanding and following up is how is racism reproduced in the way of policy programs and societal institutions and structures. Critical race theory serves the purpose of providing a race-based interdisciplinary theoretical framework for analysis. As an academic discipline, it examines the way in which racism operates in different scales and complexities in society. One, it recognizes the permanence of racism, whiteness as a property, with the privileges that whites publicly enjoy in institutions and policymaking. It provides a critique of liberalism. It talks of interest convergence, hegemony structures that benefit the disempowered and underprivileged only. Benefits for disempowered and underprivileged only emerge when they align and converge with the interest of the dominant group. Again, that the majority of people only get the kind of reforms that they need or that is desired when they converge or submit themselves to the dominant discourse of white supremacism. And most important, it's based on counter narratives, listening and hearing what the people on the ground are saying. I'll just break some of the issues that I've raised. The hegemonic power structure is a form of oppression not imposed by physical force. Rather, power succeeds when the dominant culture controls subordinate parts of society to get the subordinates to become complicit in their own oppression. And you see this in my view and in my case studies that the majority of Black farmers have actually been almost overshadowed or subjected or subjugated by the dominance of this hegemonic power structure, which is a vestige of apartheid racism. And the resultant discourse of obviously there is a critical race theory of agrarian reforms. Intersectionality is a watchful of the misconception of race as principally or singularly a matter of mind instead of a means of power reproduction of material, social structures, institutional, spatial, and ideological dimensions. That's how powerful intersectionality is. It begins to look at intersectionality, not only in terms of race, but in terms of gender, in terms of many other embedded forms of discrimination and separation. Interest convergence has its origin in the Marxist theory that the bourgeois will allow progress for the proletariat only if this progress profits the bourgeois even more. Also, interest convergence arises from the liberal program that assumed the social conditions for Black people will improve through gradual and prolonged reforms to the legal system. Again, this is quite obvious and apparent when one interacts with Black farmers, that the only time that their concerns are being considered and seriously regarded is when really their interests converge in one way or the other with those of the dominant class, which is, I mean, in this instance, in agriculture, and the structuring of agriculture, mostly white people. Just briefly on the findings. The findings back really body of scholarly work on segregated agriculture and its impact on Black farmers to the new democratic dispensation. My findings are based on a summary of some of the findings and the data that I obtained from the field. I interviewed more than 63 people, but I've just highlighted really 3 or 4 instances just to give us an understanding of what the experiences are on the field. The first person I spoke to amongst many was a land activist who has, I mean, more than 30 years in the field of land reform and rural development, and has served in various, I mean, committees which were engaged with the issues of land reform and land redistribution. Now, he emphasized the issue of racial segregation and its impact on the issues of and how it perpetuates injustice and inequality in the country. He talks of the marginalization of Black farmers and the perpetuation of the stereotype of Black farmers as predominantly subsistence and rural. He also emphasized the issue that, I mean, white settler regime not only obliterated forms, indigenous forms of agriculture, but it also wiped out the indigenous practices and indigenous institutions in terms of how Black people practice agriculture. He talks of the many years of colonialism and its impact on land and agrarian reforms in South Africa as we experience them today. On the subject of the expansion of the neoliberal capitalism, he comments, it systematically wipes out the owners of land and their culture. Everything is subject to the influence of capital, the prioritization of profit, and the subordination of some over the others. Images of Black farmers are mired in racist stereotypes and stigmatization. This deficit idea that Blacks are intellectually, culturally, and socially unable to farm. Blacks are exploited as a source of cheap labor on white farms. Now, I mean, most of us would actually, be familiar with this, that, well, Blacks are unable to farm either because they're culturally not so inclined to farm, they lack the intellectual capacity, they're not culturally able, or socially, they're not socialized to be farmers. These are all the stigmatization and stereotypes that one encounters when one talks to emerging Black farmers. The next person I spoke to was the chairperson of the CPA, which is a land restitution case. Now, they were returned to their land, and he raises the issue of returning to their land, and also the issue of the establishment and the registration of a CPA. He says, instead of the CPA opening up doors for support from the state and public institution, instead the CPA has become a hindrance for them to be able to farm sustainably. Because in most institutions that they interact with and people that they talk to, the CPA as an institution is not properly recognized. So he raises that the CPAs in themselves almost are a hindrance and a shackle that they as emerging Black farmers have to try and negotiate when they interact with both private and public institutions. The third person I spoke to is a member of a women's cooperative. And she emphasized that she was born a farmer, and all of the members of the cooperative are farmers. But again, she stresses the issue of struggling as women to get access to support both from the public sector and from the private sector. She says in some instances they have had, white males being sent to them to begin to support and help them. But she says the problem with this white explaining, she called it white explaining, white men explaining to Black women as to how to farm and do agriculture when they've been doing this for many years. She says the problem with these white mentors is that they are trying to fix us as women, and they ignore the social and economic power structure of capitalism. So the issue here with the white mentors is that you guys must get right, you guys must do it this way and the other, but then ignore that there's a social economic structure that denies them to become who they want to be. So, and she says that is actually the problem that needs to be investigated rather than trying to fix them as individual farmers. The fourth person I spoke to was a school principal who's a livestock farmer. Also, emphasized that, for generations, this family has been involved with cattle farming, but they're encountering a problem because they're farming on communal land. They're trying to move on to, private land. They can't lease land, they can't buy land because they don't have the funds and resources, to do so. In fact, they've been forced now to start even, diversifying and get into sheep farming to subsidize their main cattle farming. Now, she argues that sheep farming, sheep, really the market is accessible and sheep are more affordable. So they use sheep to subsidize their main farming practice, which is livestock. Now, he says, people on communal land need a particular consideration when it comes to investment, in terms of loans and support systems that they can. But saying that the farming practices that he is involved with now is really taking out money from him rather than bringing in money for him. I'll briefly get into the analysis and, and perhaps, yeah. So the O'Connor says that race is conceptualized by means of two major lenses, race as a variable and race as subculture. Racism is entrenched in agrarian relations and agrarian structures by corporate interests to maintain dominance over disadvantaged societies. It's not an existential coincidence that land and race summits the catalog of reparation and restoration discourses, while justice and equality are relentlessly pursued. The ongoing racism is a result of the vestiges of many years of structural and structurally racist structures that disowned Blacks of their land resources and ignore their humanity. And I can tell you in most communities, these things are still prevalent 30 years after democracy and many other programs. Young argues that for transformation to transpire as much more than disconnected acts of random reforms, policy interventions must first address the basic epistemological and philosophical assumptions that inform their practices. Vestiges of systematic institutional racism continue to harm generations of Black farmers and poor rural communities that face rooted institutional and economic barriers, mainly to access productive resources like land, water, investment, technology, and infrastructure. Black farmers assert that race is still a major issue in their experiences, saying that class alone does not explain their exclusion. Again, most complain that they are unable to acquire productive land other than where the land that they've been, communal land they've access to. Explain the importance of theory. As Aldua calls for the origination of theories built on those whose pieces of knowledge are traditionally excluded from and silenced by academic research. In addition, she asserts that beyond creating theories, we need to find practical application for those theories. We must de-academize theory and connect the community to the academy. On praxis, Ferrer says, emphasis the interdependence of critical consciousness and social interaction as an essential disposition trait for building anti-racist and anti-oppressive learning and development for the historically marginalized. Now, the point I'm trying to emphasize here, we have been, look, I'm talking the first person. We have been alienated from our land because of white supremacist ideologies and whatever, and one needs to interrogate this and dismiss and challenge some of these theories. So what has been created by theory, in my view, can also be, should be challenged by theory, counter theories, which is very important. Racism and class. Exploring racism in agrarian reforms is complex. It's compounded by lack of theoretical agrarian concept and analytical tools to sustain empirical narratives on racism. Marx explains race as a class antagonism found within capitalism, and Lenin viewed race as a primary source of empowering divisions within the international working class. Again, clearly race has been used as a way of sowing and bringing division within class formation in society broadly. Herrenfolk democracy defines some population groups as outsiders or others, not part of the Herrenfolk or the people, or even as subhuman. Now, this is quite clear with those who have experienced, apartheid domination, where the whites were the supreme human beings, the supreme and dominant, group within society. Any other thing else was subordinate and subjected to white Herrenfolkism, though they called themselves a democracy. Lenin criticized liberal democracy and cultural autonomy schemes, especially those plotted by intellectuals or elites within the oppressor nation. Karl Marx and Lenin engaged with what Engels referred to the peasant question to express ongoing debates regarding the fate of the peasantry under capitalism. It involves the question of an agrarian society that embodies wider cultural, political, economic, and societal diversity, and how they interact may be more suitable or practical. Pascal observed that race is widely identified as a common sense, defining as a saturation of cultural knowledge that we cannot fail to recognize, and which through society, it very obviously passes without notice. And again, this is what I noticed and what is observed by the farmers that I spoke to. Pascal argues white supremacy displays overtly racist acts, but also within everyday practices and belief that sustain whiteness as a standard and perpetuates racism regardless of one's intention. Cross utilized the analytical framework of new racism in teacher education, clarifying white privilege as maintained through visible insidious operations of power that fosters whiteness and racism. This is quite clear when one looks at the agricultural sector in South Africa, that white agriculture is held up as the model to be followed without actually interrogating its usefulness in terms of arguments like food security and sustainability. It is the way in which Black farmers have to be tutelaged to assume and adopt wide ways of doing things without actually trying to question and understand whether or not the white agricultural mechanisms are sustainable and are just, are fair and equitable. Now, why do I then argue for a critical race theory in agrarian reform? Particularly when as a method of research and also as a way of developing a methodological framework within which to conduct research to highlight the issues of race and racism as experienced by Black farmers. Smith says research is a site of struggle between the interest and ways of knowing of the West and the interest and ways of resisting the other. Observing limitations, the tools to analysis racism in agrarian reforms. A critical race theory in agrarian reform is premised on critical race theories such as the following: as an analytical framework to theorize and explore the ways race and racism implicitly and explicitly impact agrarian structures and relations, as well as socioeconomic and political power structures. A critical race theory in agrarian reform perspective on agrarian reforms would bring to the fore a critical analysis of systems of reform and reparation. This is the essence of my argument. Say, in our academic endeavors and our academic research, there should be a way of listening to those who are more often not listened to, or those who are more often ignored when you conduct these researches. But most importantly, one of the issues, that the issue in which the language we use and the phrasing that we use in bringing to the fore some of the experiences of the Black farmers. My point is that the language that is sometimes we see and use not only reflects, but sometimes perpetuates these racial discrepancies. And I've seen quite a lot of researchers that I've read, which perhaps intentionally or unintentionally perpetuates white supremacist ideas and ideals. A critical race theory on agrarian reform perspective is based on critical race theory, and is aligned to nexus of methodical practices, substantive theory, and epistemological foundation that constitute the methodology of engaging with racist issues. The methodology focuses on theory and manifests in the process of directly investigating specific instances within the social world. A critical race theory on agrarian reform theorizes Black farmers so as to substantiate their ontological existence and epistemological left experiences in discourses on agrarian change. It facilitates discursive practices dedicated to conscious and systematic eradication of all forms of agrarian inequalities, global imperialism, and subjugation of developing nation and indigenous groups. This is my argument and justification for why we need a critical theory on agrarian reform, and why academics and researchers should have in mind a critical agrarian reform race theory when they conduct their research. So what is the question might be, what is critical about the critical agrarian reform theory that I'm proposing? A fundamental premise of critical race theory in agrarian reform is that scholars must acknowledge the social systems and structures that impact the reality of landless people. First, it requires scholars to consider the systematic and structural forces affecting historically dispossessed and exploited communities. Second, it challenges the common narrative of deficit thinking that Black people are unable to or lack the skills of. Those kind is what is critical of. Thirdly, it challenges the one-size-fits-all model based on colorblind narratives. You almost have a prescriptive way of intervention by policymakers that all forms of land and agrarian reforms must fit into this model, which is actually more often than not neoliberal, without interrogating its importance. Critical race theory and agrarian reform focuses on the substance of intersectionality in theorizing ways to challenge injustice and inequality. That is what is critical about this proposed critical race theory on agrarian reform. In conclusion, a critical race theory of agrarian reform perspective is rooted within the lived experience, knowledge, systems, practices, norms, and values of the landless and poor. It is critical of studies that favor neoliberal and minimal states which are hostile to the environment and humankind. And again, my point I'm stressing is that for land reform and agrarian reforms to happen, we need a very strong and interventionist state to facilitate a transformation. You can't have a minimalist state that is not involved and intervene in the reconfiguration and restructuring of agrarian reform relations in the country. Marx says the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And that's what I'm proposing with the creative say. The idea is not really only to understand land and agrarian reforms, but our responsibility is to change the perceptions and the thinkings that are happening in society. So critical race theory and agrarian reform as an interdisciplinary approach is a powerful means to which to theorize agrarian reforms as an integral part of the social system. You can't look at it in isolation to other forces which are embedded in society that makes Black people subjects in their own country. Ngiyabonga.
For that input. And this, yeah, thanks again. And for sharing your ideas, your thoughts, and that have come out of your PhD research. So this is, we're opening it up. So you are all who are here attending, welcome to put questions, to join the chat and give feedback, contribute your ideas. What do you think? Zakes is clearly arguing for a critical race theory of agrarian reform. What do you think of it? Is he crazy? Is it meaningful? What do you think? So please do, let's join in, and we can, enable you to speak. So you can put your hand up, you can put things in the chat as well. And Zakes, I have one question for you to think about. Then I'm going to say a couple of things, but I'm going to let you think about it. Which is maybe just to say, maybe you could explain a little bit why, or the question is, why were the agri-parks a good entry point for looking at these questions? I think just to elaborate a little bit more on that, the usefulness of the agri-parks and why the agri-parks as a lens through which to look at these questions. And while you're just pondering that, I mean, for me, I just want to emphasize that yeah, it's kind of strange that we come from this history in South Africa that has been so racialized, and including then the agrarian structures, from the colonial time and the apartheid time, which were specifically set up with racial parameters in terms of who was benefiting, who was excluded, and how it was set up. Yet there really does seem to be a dearth of real analysis of the race dynamics of our current agrarian reform. Of course, there's always this talk in land reform, to benefit Black farmers, the emerging Black farmers and so on. But there's a great lack of theorizing race within that. So we talk about Black farmers and emerging Black farmers, but without theorizing it. And I think often without much analysis of those race dynamics and how they've shaped the agricultural sector and how they continue to shape it. And as Zake said there, white agriculture is held up as the model and uncritically held up as a model without interrogating continuously how it was shaped in this way and the basis of that shaping, and then who are the winners and losers in that. So certainly I think there's a lot of value in taking forward this discussion and making this kind of contribution. And also in the context, of course, where land reform is not doing very well. Many would argue it's failing, both in terms of a lack of actual distribution of land, as well as in terms of the agricultural production coming out on that land. It is not anywhere near what the aims have been, the targets have been. So there's a lot of need to rethink the approach and rethink why it's not working. Those are my couple of thoughts. But Zakes, can you elaborate a little bit on the agri-parks and why that's a good lens to look at these questions?
Yeah, the agri-parks were launched in 2010 as part of a comprehensive rural development program. And the main idea really was to, amongst others, that we'll have, first that there'll be an agri-park in each of the 44 districts. And the agri-parks would be based in local districts to encourage maximum participation from rural communities. And they were piloted as ways of, one, deracializing agriculture in South Africa. Two, to integrate Black emerging farmers into the global agricultural system in a nutshell. There is much to it, but yeah. Okay,
cool. So as one of the sort of premier or flagship government programs for restructuring agriculture, it certainly becomes, I would agree with Zakes, a useful lens to look at then what's the nature of that change and what issues are considered and not considered, and what are the experiences of Black farmers themselves that are supposed to be the beneficiaries or perhaps the victims of these programs. Other comments or questions? You can raise your hands if you want to. Okay, I see a hand there. Zakele Nkosi, I'm going to promote you to a panelist, so you will have speaking rights. Zakele is rejoining as a panelist. I could have just allowed to talk. That would be quick. I should have just done that, but Zakele will be with us just now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Zakele, welcome. Do you want to put your video on? Are you okay?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, there we go.
No problem.
You're very welcome.
I'm from the geology department. I saw this and I thought I should just join because I'm interested in such conversations, especially because we're also thinking about critical race theory in the natural sciences, even though it's a bit taboo apparently. And one of the questions I've had or been thinking about is this idea of the ability to reclaim or go back to a state of being that is untouched by the colonial impact. And this obviously now in the context of the agrarian sector of our country. Is it possible for us to sort of go back to a state of being that is untouched by coloniality? Because I look at our farmers and I look at even systems that we have. I mean, we've transitioned from, we were told for a long time that subsistence farming is outdated. People need to move away from rural areas, go to urban areas, and we need to mechanize and industrialize farming. And then now in the West, white people are going back to the rural areas and going back to subsistence farming. And we have lost quite literally not only all the knowledge, but a lot of quite intellectual property or technology, such as understanding how the African climate and the soil and how to farm what, when. And in addition to that, grain, you know, I encountered a beautiful grain the other time on a podcast where they're talking about fonio, which is this very resistant grain, which is a type of rice that was apparently grown across the continent, and that has basically been decimated or disappeared, and no one knows how to grow it anymore. And because we're using, you know, rice that is imported from elsewhere and grain that is imported from everywhere else. So, and this has got me thinking that, I mean, we've lost so much. And so even for any of us to say we are able to recoup ourselves, our sense of dignity of being outside of the white state of affairs or white supremacy, I find it very impossible. And so the question is, if we then are asking farmers to think of themselves in a critical race perspective, is that even possible in the context of white supremacy being such a very permanent state of affairs, not only now, but also piercing through the past? So how can we do that? How can we reclaim it? Which, by the way, I appreciate and I respect, but from a praxis perspective, it's impossible to escape Meneer Piet van der Westhuizen and his knowledge bank and I mean also they control everything. The entire supply chain is controlled by white men, and so it is impossible to escape their presence in any way. In fact, if you want to be a successful farmer, one of the things that people tell you is that you need to make sure you've got a circle of white farmers who are able to open doors for you, or else you will not get your food from the ground all the way to someone's plate. At least that's more or less my question and comment, all fused into one.
Thanks, Zakele. Thanks a lot. Zakes, over to you. There's quite a lot there.
Yeah, thanks. I think first and foremost is that, in my view, a critical race theory of agrarian reform is a emancipatory theory. It is trying to revolutionize the way in which we consider ourselves and the transformation of and changes within society. Now, most important is that it is a way of trying to understand and interpret society as it functions now, and say what kind of society would best respond to the common ideals of humanity, and also contribute to a much more sustainable an environment. Now, in that sense, it is a way of thinking that almost unshackle us from all forms of, subordination, like racial subordination, the issues of undermining the unsustainable ways of farming, but to say, in what way can we find suitable and sustainable ways of of farming? And there are many other options, for argument's sake, agroecology, which begins to look at some of these questions. Say, how do we transform all of society in a way in which it functions to the best interest of all of us? And that, to me, is what I think is the challenge, and that we should respond to as researchers.
Okay, thanks, Zex. If I can just add in, and anyone can object to me or what I say, but I think I didn't hear Zex arguing, and I don't think critical race theory or decolonial approaches argue for some idea that we can go back to pre-colonialism as if it never happened. I think the point of the critical race theory is that we can't be colorblind. We can't ignore those past, those histories and the way they shape today. So we have to engage with them. And the decolonial approach it consciously engages with the impact of colonialism. Again, it's not to reject other ideas or every technology that happens to be associated with colonialism or with white farming, but it's about a rebalancing and evaluating what was put aside and what was undermined and what was marginalized, and bringing forward the other voices, foregrounding different voices and different knowledge and technology. So I would say it like that. Zex, you can agree. I saw you nodding.
No, I agree. Yeah. It really does. It's not a nostalgic kind of framing that we should go back to the way in which we did things. But if there are good practices in the past that were, which are still sustainable, which can actually be used, of course they should be. There were agricultural systems that were pursued in Africa and other parts of the world, which were much more sustainable. And those are very important, lessons, to be learned. But by saying so, it does not mean one is anti-advancement, anti-technology, anti-transformation. No, it's not anti those, yes.
But at the same time, it's very hard to imagine that we could, really transform and restructure agriculture in South Africa in a more equitable way without some critique and deconstruction of what is there and was created for hundreds of years through colonialism and apartheid. And Zakele, you put it well, in terms of the impact of that. But then Zex, the other part of the question I think you didn't address was, well, I heard Zakele kind of saying, well, is there any point? We can't do anything about it. We can't be in a space without the white men. Even the white man is moderating here. So what do you think? Is it an impossible struggle? Maybe it's a needed struggle, but are you being realistic, or perhaps, as Zakele seemed to be questioning, maybe it's impossible?
No, it's not by any way an anti-white theorizing. It's not an anti-white theorizing. It's when we liberate Black farmers, in that liberation, we'll have the liberation of society as a whole. So it not only liberates the Black person, it liberates all of us. Now but to do that, you have to demystify this thing, the mythology of white supremacy, or focus and say, it's a lie. It's a lie. And if you establish that kind of a reasoning, then you can say, we need a common humanity to restructure ourselves and restructure society. It's not an anti-white, negating white people, so to speak, but saying, let's all of us as society, as people, as humankind, come together and work together for our common good and the good of the environment.
But is that possible? Or is this
of course it is. It depends how one looks at history. My point is that you have to have contestations within society, and within those contestations and contradictions, a new thing and a new way of seeing things and doing things would happen. The fact that we are here is because of several contradictions that have happened in the past and continue to happen to change and transform a society. It might not happen tomorrow, but it's a sustained struggle of opposites between those who are for and those who are against, and see what synthesis comes up about. So it's not an overnight kind of a struggle, but it is a struggle with waging. People said, when like your point, when we said we are fighting against apartheid, oh no, the white people will rule forever. you know, and we fought apartheid is down, but institution is still there. We still, experience it, but institutionally, I mean, ideologically, I mean, it's being challenged.
Great, thanks. Okay, I see in the chat a question from Lena. Lena, would you like to verbalize it? I can give you speaking rights and you can verbalize it if you want to. Lena from University of Helsinki, Finland. Okay, I shall give you, you can speak in your own voice. I think you're allowed to talk. Zakeli, I'm going to put you back to an attendee just so I don't get confused. So don't be surprised if your status changes and your voice is silenced again. Thanks for your contribution. Lena, I think you can talk.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Thanks for joining us.
Sorry, my name is Iina. Lina. It's a Finnish name, double I-N-A. Okay. Thank you very much, Sakes, and congratulations for getting this far with your PhD. I have been thinking of, you know, I did some work on how Nordic countries supported Southern Africa during the apartheid struggle. At the moment, I work at the Embassy of Finland here in Pretoria, but I'm not talking in my capacity as a diplomat, talking my capacity as a researcher, the University of Helsinki, and I have done work on liberation struggle and European relations. And now recently I've been looking at how things changed, because we know that especially the Nordic countries that were very adamant against the apartheid system and supported the struggle. After the changes, early 90s, there was a very big move towards to what I say in brackets, normalize the relations with South Africa. And we know that trade became one of the biggest driving force for collaboration. And having looked at the way the policy now, especially of Finland, were formed, it was very, let's say, reform oriented. Obviously, the ownership of the South African policies is with the South Africans, and at that time transforming democratic dispensation. But I'm looking at possible biases, or like you are saying, sort of colorblind understanding of the South African dynamics and situation, because in a sense, you know, that radical foreign policy, what the Nordic countries sort of practiced during the 80s, kind of moved into a normal sort of foreign relations, and we were no more interested in supporting a more critical or profound reform. And I wonder if it had something to do with our understanding of the, like you were saying, you were talking about deficit thinking, or our trust on understanding whether the new leaders or the non-white population can actually run the country. So my interest is what the Finns or the decision makers and the policy makers did at that time. So I just wanted to know if anyone, if you know, Sakes, or anybody else knows if this critical race theory that also has become quite popular in Finland and the Nordic countries recently among the younger generation, if anybody has applied it to foreign policy or international relations. That's my question basically, and sorry for taking some too much time perhaps. Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. So Zakes, any thoughts yourself on that? And of course, and if you any information as is requested about people who might be studying this, and anyone else who's in the event, you've got ideas on this, you're welcome to also share them in the chat as well. So.
Just perhaps to say, thanks. I haven't had the time. I hate talking about this. During my stay on Robben Island, I was adopted by a family from Finland who looked after my family whilst I was in prison. And on my release, I tried to find them. I've never been able to find them, just to thank them. Just one day when you go back to Finland, just shout out and say, Zakes says, thank you very much for that. Yeah, coming to really, I'm not sure. I mean, how much work is being done in the country around critical race theory, just more broadly. And I'm just also, I mean, happy that Zakhele is saying they're actually doing some work around that. I perhaps would like to engage more with Zakhele and see what can, what we can do. But I'm sure we're also aware that, I mean, there is in the US, an attack on critical race theory, trying to suppress it in terms of, being taught in at schools and also as a way of research. But really, I wouldn't know what initiatives are underway in the country. I'm sorry about that.
Any thoughts yourself, Zakes, on the extent to which you think sort of foreign policy should be taking into account critical race theory more or less and so on?
To be honest, I haven't given it a thought. Let me just be honest, I haven't given it a thought and I wouldn't really want to. But I mean, there are a lot of, discourses around the decoloniality. Perhaps one could look at those areas and see how one begins to, engage with those kind of struggles. But I haven't given it a thought, let me be honest about it.
Okay, thanks. And I see Ini. Now I see the correct spelling of the name. I was reading the capital I as an L. Thanks, Ina. Thanks for that. So, Zakes, she shared the email, so maybe you can follow up. Maybe you can find that family who assisted that. Yeah, I'm also not clear on people who've done specific work on critical race theory and foreign relations. I mean, at University of Pretoria, someone who is a leading thinker to some extent on critical race theory is Joel Modiri, who's in the law faculty. And he's certainly written on the sort of color of law, and it was one of his papers, and looking at critical race theory in post-apartheid South Africa. So I can't remember how much he also touched on foreign affairs issues there. So I think one might find it in some of the international law studies that are trying to apply critical race theory, and they overlap into foreign affairs as well. So something for us to look out for, and maybe for our foreign affairs department at University of Pretoria too, an international relations department to look into. I'm still taking any other questions. We did on the flyer for this say that it was running until 11:30. So I'm not rushing to round up, but if we don't have other comments and questions, we might round up earlier. But in my mind, I'm still targeting 11:30. So just so in case some people assume it's an hour and we're supposed to finish at 11. No, we're still in time. Okay, Coletta, your chat is there. Do you want to verbalize your comment as well, Coletta? Asking about the building capacity on the practicalities of the theory. Okay, let me read the question, but Coletta, you're welcome to join in. I can give you can speak as well. So Coletta is saying perhaps we should think a little bit more about building capacity on the practicalities of the theory. Unfortunately, the contestations and contradictions don't always end well. It's almost as if you can't work with the theory without being accused of being racist. I was just listening to you, Zakes, and I felt challenged as to how to approach this. So Zakes, well done for leaving someone feeling challenged. And any thoughts on that, Zakes? I mean, there is this real, any thoughts, Zakes?
Yeah, I think it is quite legitimate. Perhaps some level of information sharing, capacitation in terms of how one, looks into these questions without really, I don't want to use the word sensitivity, but maybe that level of sensitivity when one deals with those narratives and, conducting those kind of researches to begin to understand, the lived experiences of people there. And I just think it takes some level of understanding, level of experience in terms of how you work with these issues. That's why I found ethnography much more useful, because you begin almost get embedded within the community, you live with the community, you understand, and you begin even to get and understand their body language in terms of how they experience and react to certain situations. And to me, that's very important as well.
And certainly I think we have to assert the right and take the space to discuss race issues without and the way in which race does continue to shape society, we should feel free and create the space to raise that and discuss that openly without falling, back on this accusation of being racist in turn. So I think even in the university, and Zakhele also gave this, you made a sort of slight side comment, Zakhele, that, you didn't always, something along the lines of saying you didn't always feel very welcome to discuss these issues. And then this comment from Coletta as well about when you try and take this approach, you get accused of being racist. So we really need to then do more to open up the space within UP and beyond UP, because if that is the way people feel, I think that's highly problematic. And then we stifle a meaningful and open debate on race and its implications. And I think that's becomes harmful to society where these issues clearly exist.
Look, I mean, just for example, I tried to analyze the Black Economic Empowerment policy on agribusiness and agri-sectors. The language that is being used is so, it proliferates, that white supremacist thinking. Some of it is actually written by Black people, but the language and that's being used, it almost perpetuates this kind of say, Black people should be helped, Black people should be elevated to certain levels so that they can get insider status into this white, agricultural formation. And when they get in, then they almost get confirmed as new entrants into this heavenly space that they're not supposed to be. And it is that kind of, language and framing in these policies that becomes problematic. As much as they're saying this, the B is trying to empower, but in that empowerment is actually ultimately disempowering in its own language, in ways they phrase issues. The Black people should be brought into the same level. Who said the white farmers were right, for argument's sake? But it's let's put them in the same level, so that the same pedestal, so they can compete with them as equal partners. But the basic social structure is unequal. Then you find, say, we'll promote, Black farmers based on meritocracy, but there is no meritocracy when you look at the social system. There's unevenness in society. How do you achieve that without, addressing the fundamental, imbalances and inequalities within society? But we'll promote you on the basis of merit. But society, it's really unequal. You look at the, I spoke to one lady who wasn't part of this, in one of the case studies. She had all these awards, and the frame is, I was, keeping my environment clean, and this kind of stuff, which is, some of it they are really badly, articulated and written in policy. And
the concept of emerging farmers' eggs.
It's quite a problematic that as if Black farmers are alien to farming, that it's something that they were not exposed to. Again, it becomes a very historical analysis and critique that we know that, the apartheid laws, we know the discrimination, we know the landlessness of Black farmers. All these things are historical issues that still impact and continue to impact, Black farmers. And I think this is some of the labels that needs to be questioned and be done away with.
Yeah, certainly when in the debates we're using labels, everyone knows if you say emerging farmer in South Africa, you were talking about a Black person. So we also have these euphemisms that we use, and partly then that we then can avoid talking explicitly about race because we use other terminology, but everyone knows what we mean. And of course, I think what you're saying now, I'm hearing it's the classic argument that is, are we trying to change a system or trying to fit people into a system, without changing it at all? And if we look at where this system of agriculture, agrarian structure, land structures in South Africa comes from, then it's clearly a system that is imbued and founded on a racist starting point. Surely it has to change a bit, not just have people incorporated into it. Okay. Any other comment or question? You're welcome to join us in talking about these things. Do Do I do a countdown or something? If I don't get it, and Zakes, any concluding words from you? And while Zakes is thinking of that, I'm still looking at the chat and the list of attendees, because anyone else is still welcome to contribute. And then I'll give Zakes a concluding minute, because we don't need to drag on longer than needed. Zakes, I'm not seeing any other hand at the moment, so any concluding remarks from your side?
Yeah, just to emphasize that I really think, I mean, a critical race theory of agrarian reform would be a very useful analytical method and tool in trying to understand and, you know, dig quite deeply and incisively into the racism that, and the scourge of racism that continues, I mean, to marginalize and, you know, discriminate against, I mean, what we now call emerging Black farmers, but much broadly, I mean, Black farmers. And just to mention, in the broader study, I also spoke to farmers outside of the agri-parks who were part of, I mean, the entire research project. But yeah, really, I just think we need to find a space of, you know, I mean, using a critical analytical framework that will really raise the issue of race and racism, especially at the institutional level, where people continue to be discriminated against based on their color and based on their gender. Thank you very much, Mark.
So thanks very much, Zakes. Thanks to everyone who attended, and thanks to the Center for Advancement of Scholarship, CAS, and especially within CAS Tafadzwa Mushonga for organizing this. Yeah, have a great day, and let's think about how we can take this forward. I see someone saying there's a hand. Okay, there's a hand. Richard April. Welcome. You should be able to talk if you unmute, Richard. Yes. Richard, welcome. I can see your mic is on, and from my side, it looks like it should be working. Maybe not working on your side. Oh.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Hi, Richard.
Yes, how are you guys? I just want to find out, after so many years of the end of apartheid, and taking into account what you guys have just described in terms of critical race theory, and one lady from America was just talking about color blindness. I just want to find out, how is this critical race theory going to help to transform actually the sector, and whether these emerging markets are subjected to certain laws and regulations such as BEE and those type of things, those type of legislation. I don't know if you understand the question.
Yeah.
Look,
I think what I'm proposing really is just an approach to begin to conduct research and frame our research, and hope to highlight and raise some of these underlying, forms of discrimination, and, you know, which would lead to a much more open way of addressing some of the underlying issues that causes those tensions in the system, really.
Well, answer. I see. Okay, Richard, you want to follow up?
Yeah, now I'll take it up with Zakes, at another level. I understand, but I just wanted to know, if you integrate this critical race theory, will it be able to change? Will it be able to help change? You know, help farmers in terms of training, help farmers in terms of how can they get better, or these emergent farmers, how can they get better in the trade that they are doing day to day, so that they can get themselves out of the current situations.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Yeah, and you're welcome to follow up with Zakes. And if you want to. But Zakes, any comment? I'm hearing Richard kind of maybe saying, where does this practically hit the ground? Where does it, in the day-to-day lives of farmers, make a difference? Nice ideas, but does it make a difference? Can it make a difference as well?
I think the issue of ideas should never, I think it's the point that I was trying to make earlier, that the issue of ideas should never be undermined in the struggles for change and transformation. That kind of contestation is very important, and support should be supported by other, action. But the issue of really engaging with different sectors and different formations is very important for transformation. I really would not undermine the issue of the exchange of ideas, and contestations and championing and standing for certain position in society and change. Those are very critical interventions. They should never be undermined.
No. And whatever training and other things we offer, if the structure of the system is working against some people, they're going to struggle to advance. So we need to question that, but we do need to translate it at the end of the day into practical activities that make a difference, but hopefully start from the right foundation, I think. Okay. Zakeli wants to come back as well. I mean, I did say to her, I was doing a wrap up, I was doing my final thanks and everything, but I appreciate the interest. So Zakeli, if you should be able to unmute yourself and contribute.
Hi guys, sorry, I couldn't help but come in there. I think it's the same situation we found ourselves during Fees Must Fall, when students were saying decolonize science, and there was a huge conversation, especially in the natural agricultural sciences faculty, where we were discussing, is there a place such a thing as decolonizing the sciences, the natural sciences, because this is seen as this this objective state, state or institution that doesn't need, has always been or tried to be empirical and objective. And I mean, of course, agriculture being a science at the heart of it, because at the heart there is a natural science component of it. And one of the things that I've learned personally in my journey as well, when looking at decoloniality, is that actually, if you think about knowledge and the epistemicide that occurred when colonization occurred, is that white supremacy told the whole world that they are the originators of, or Western world is the originator of all knowledge. And if you start peeling back the ideas and knowledge of agriculture, and you find that obviously when we now have Western knowledge now that sees itself almost isolated from the rest of the world, you wouldn't have Western modern knowledge without the cosmology of all kinds of knowledge that have been taken brutally from people and reconfigured as Western knowledge. And this is also, I think for me, that's a takeaway I'm getting, and I've been also getting for myself when teaching geology, is to say all knowledge belongs to everyone. Even what white farmers are doing today is technically informed by what farmers were doing thousands of years ago in Egypt or in Central Africa and in China, elsewhere. But of course, Western centralization has taught the world that only the history of knowledge starts with the what you call Socrates and all those guys, and everything before that was just non-knowledge, and that's nonsense, right? And so even right now, what white farmers are doing, most of them, when they came in, part of the knowledge of how to interact with the land and the climate was taken from the people. So the colonial encounter wasn't just about segregation, it was also about taking and silencing. And the taking part also means that every kind of knowledge that we have today cannot have existed without prior knowledges that have existed elsewhere, and obviously through the brutal encounters. So even for me, and it has helped me a lot as a scholar to also center myself in saying, no, I'm not participating in Western only knowledge. I'm participating in the cosmology of the world's knowledge. This is the world's own. And of course, now I'm taking my claim and actually taking ownership to saying that geology from a South African perspective has a potential of actually adding to the entire tapestry of knowledge. So that's at least what I think critical race theory is suggesting that we do, to say that ideas definitely need to contest its space, and also for the future, because if we don't have contesting ideas, we have the situation where we have now, where capitalism is ravaging our world, because that's the only idea that has managed to win the stage. But now other ideas are contesting the space to say, we cannot function like this, it's not sustainable. So that's at least the takeaway I have, and I'm also applying personally in my space as a scientist.
Thanks, okay. Zex, any quick response?
No, thanks, Tom. Okay, thanks, Mark. Thanks.
Harvard. Okay, thanks, Akeli. So we take your input and the other inputs. Thanks for everyone who contributed, Ina, Richard, Zakeli. And hopefully we see some of you again soon. Thanks, Zex. Have a good day, everyone.